I, Mr. Legg, am the lead police officer in charge of investigating the murders on Soldier Island, and Inspector Main is my second in command. He has collected all the evidence about the murders on Soldier Island.
Soldier Island is an isolated island off the coast of Sticklehaven, Devon, that Mr. Wargrave hired Mr. Isaac Morris to purchase under the anonymous name of U.N. Owen, Mr. Owen, where 10 adults were found dead. Our headquarters received in the mail a letter in a bottle containing the confession of the 10 murders committed on the isolated island. We gather here today to discuss this case.
Of 10 people that traveled to, then, were found dead on Soldier Island, we will begin with Lawrence John Wargrave. First, in his confession, Mr. Wargrave writes, "I shall finish writing this. I shall enclose it and seal it in a bottle, and I shall throw the bottle into the sea. It was my ambition to invent a murder mystery that no one could solve, but no, I have. A wish that someone should know just how clever I have been."
Wargrave was a recently retired judge. He was a very intelligent man, and as stated in his confession letter, he was seeking a thrill. He wanted to commit murders, but he wanted to do so in a big way if he ever went through with it. Since he had a natural passion for giving the guilty the punishment they deserve, a strong sense of justice combined with a sadistic delight to murder, he created his complex murder mystery. He began with collecting names of 9 people that were guilty, yet escaped to be guilty on paper. The order of death upon the island had been subjected by me to special thought and care. There were, I considered, amongst my guests, varying degrees of guilt. Those whose guilt was the lightest should, I decided, pass out first, that the more cold-blooded offenders were to suffer. Reports from the diary of Vera Claythorne and Emily Brent say the crowd of 10 had dinner then gathered in the living room, where a gramophone played a pre-recorded tape. It accused every person of the murder of...
There was a nursery rhyme on the wall of every room. The first verse: 10 little soldier boys went out to dine. One choked his little self, and then there were 9. The first death upon Soldier Island was Anthony James Marston, a man still in his youth. Anthony Marston often drove recklessly, paired with a lack of attention. He killed 2 small children in a car accident and demonstrated no remorse. Wargrave wrote in his confession, "Potassium cyanide is easily obtained by householders for putting down wasps. I had some in my possession, and it was easy to slip it into Marston's almost empty glass during the tense period of gramophone recital."
The second verse: 9 little soldier boys sat up very late. One overslept himself, and then there were 8. The second death upon Soldier Island was Ethel Rogers, the wife housekeeper at the mansion. She and her husband had neglected Miss Brady, a woman they served. However, she had been mostly under the manipulation of her husband. Wargrave writes in his confession, "When Rogers brought up some brandy for his wife, he set it down on a table, and in passing that table, I put the stuff into the brandy. It was easy. Suspicion had not begun to set in."
At this point, Mr. Rogers notices that there are only 8 soldier figurines on the table, while there were 10 to start. He figures out the soldiers on the table represent the people left on the island.
The third verse: 8 little soldier boys traveling in Devon. One said he'd stay there, and then there were 7. The third death upon Soldier Island was John Gordon MacArthur. He was the oldest guest and was guilty of sending a Lieutenant Arthur Richmond to his death because Richmond was the man his wife was cheating on him with. According to Vera's diary, MacArthur sat on the beach regretting his past decision and accepting his death.
Wargrave wrote in his confession, "General MacArthur met his death quite painlessly. He did not hear me come up behind him. I had to choose my time for leaving the terrace very carefully, but everything was successful."
The fourth verse: 7 little soldiers chopping up sticks. One chopped himself in half, and then there were 6. The fourth death upon Soldier Island was Thomas Rogers, the husband housekeeper. He, like his wife, was involved in neglecting the care of the woman they were serving. Mr. Wargrave writes in his confession, "I killed Rogers on the morning of August 10th. He was chopping sticks for lighting the fire and did not hear me approach." In the diaries of Vera Claythorne and Emily Brent, it was described that Mr. Rogers had been hit in the back of the head with the axe.
The fifth verse: 6 little soldier boys playing with a hive. A bumblebee stung one, and then there were 5. The 5th death upon Soldier Island was Emily Caroline Brent, a closed and religious woman who came to Soldier Island for a vacation. Mrs. Brent was guilty of firing and kicking out her pregnant maid, which drove the woman, Beatrice Taylor, to suicide. Mr. Wargrave wrote in his confession, "At breakfast, I slipped my last dose of chloral into Miss Brent's coffee when I was refilling her cup. I slipped in the dining room a little while later. She was unconscious, and it was easy to inject a strong solution of cyanide into her."
The 6th verse: 5 little soldier boys going in for law. One got chancery, and then there were 4. The 6th death upon Soldier Island was Lawrence John Wargrave, the mastermind himself. Prior to his death, he had been posing as the peacekeeper. He was leading the group and helping make more sense of what was going on. Wargrave wrote in his confession, "Once I was supposed to be dead, I could move about the house and spy upon the unknown murderer." Armstrong was keen on the idea. We carried it out that evening. A little plaster of red mud on my forehead. The only person who would examine me closely was Armstrong. He was the doctor of the bunch. It worked perfectly.
The 7th verse. 4 little soldier boys going out to sea. A red herring swallowed one, and then there were 3. The 7th death upon Soldier Island was Edward George Armstrong. He was a successful doctor who had come to Soldier Island for the sick Mr. Owens. He's guilty for killing an old woman operating her being drunk. After helping Mr. Wargrave fake his death, Armstrong, trusting Wargrave, was lured to the cliffs. Wargrave wrote in his confession, "I took him up a little way behind the house, on the edge of the cliff. It was quite easy. Leant over the cliff, told him to look. Wasn't that the mouth of a cave? Quick, vigorous push sent him off his balance and splash into the heaving sea below." The 8th verse. 3 little soldier boys walking in a zoo. A big bear hugged one, and then there were 2. The 8th death upon Soldier Island was William Henry Blore. He was an investigator called to protect Owen's jewels from thieves. He was guilty of sending an innocent man to a penal colony to gain promotion for himself. Wargrave wrote in his confession, "I watched them from the windows of the house. When Blore came up alone, I had the big marble clock poised ready. Exit Blore."
The 9th verse. 2 little soldier boys sitting in the sun, one got frizzled up, and then there was one. The 9th death upon Soldier Island was Philip Lombard. He was an ex-soldier hired by Mr. Owen to watch for trouble. Lombard was guilty for leaving a group of African natives to die in combat to save himself. Wargrave wrote in his confession, "From my window I saw Vera Claythorne shoot Lombard. As soon as that had happened, I set the stage in her bedroom."
The 10th verse. 1 little soldier boy left all alone. He went and hanged himself, and then there were none. The 10th death upon Soldier Island was Vera Claythorne. She was a schoolteacher that was hired to be a secretary. Vera was guilty of telling a young boy under her care to swim out to a big rock in the ocean, and she pretended to try and save the child. She did this to get the child's father, her lover, all to herself. Wargrave wrote in his confession, "Would the consciousness of her own guilt, the state of nervous tension consequent on having just shot a man, be sufficient, together with the hypnotic suggestion of the surroundings, to cause her to take her own life? Vera Claythorne hanged herself before my eyes, where I stood in the shadow of the wardrobe."
And now I shall finish writing this. I shall enclose it and seal it in a bottle, and I shall throw the bottle into the sea. Why? It was my ambition to invent a murder mystery that no one could solve. But no artist, I realize, can be satisfied with art alone. There is a natural craving for recognition. I have a pitiful human wish that someone should know just how clever I have been. I shall be found laid neatly on my bed, shot through the forehead in accordance with the record kept by my fellow victims. Times of death cannot be stated with any accuracy by the time bodies are examined. When the sea goes down, there will come from the mainland boats and men, and they will find 10 dead bodies and an unsolved problem on Soldier Island. Signed, Lawrence Wargrave.